Howdy, historians. Welcome to Africa Part 8, African Imperialism Part 2. Congratulations! These are the last notes you will ever take for cultures and civilizations. Basically, your last day of class. Woot woot! It's a lot more enjoyable to say that in person. It's a lot more enjoyable to have a little party and munch on a cookie or something and drink a little Diet Coke and then say, woot woot, last day of class. But hey, this is the world we live in, and it's still exciting to know that you're at the end of your freshman year of social studies getting ready for whatever sophomore year holds, whether that's US history or AP Gov or whatever it holds for you. But we got a few things to cover today. This will be a relatively short video. Admittedly, we're taking a very abbreviated look at everything here in the last unit because we're moving through at kind of lightning speed. I want to give you a nice overview of, Africa's geography, some ancient kingdoms, what imperialism is and how it impacted Africa. But, we're just under a time crunch, and that's okay, right? You're still getting some good info, so that way when it comes up in other classes, you've at least got some background on it. So, I'm saying so a lot today. Wow. European countries take over all of Africa except for Ethiopia and Liberia. Now, the process that was undertaken in all of these areas was different. Again, if we were in class, we'd go in more detail about it. We'd do like kind of a case study of South Africa and the Congo and a couple other areas to see the brutality, the exploitation, the manipulation, the negative cultural diffusion, the long-term negative impacts. But here, we'll just look at some general ideas. Now, African imperialism is really going to have, like I just kind of briefly mentioned, a terribly negative impact on the continent. Most of Africa's modern problems can be traced back to imperialism. But when did it start to end? Right? The independence movement really began after World War II. That's when we saw large-scale independence sweeping across the continent of Africa. So after World War II, during the 1950s and 60s, there was a wave of independence sweeping across Africa as European nations really saw the problems that empires created. Empires were a big factor in the causes for both World War I and World War II. So Europe started to embrace a policy known as self-determination. Let countries self-determine what type of government they want and who they want to work with economically, what type of economic system they want to have. So some positives resulted from this as countries gained their independence, but there were also a lot of negatives to go along with this, and lots of instances of destruction and violence in the wake of independence, as suddenly people were rapidly freed but left in a weakened state from the way that they were exploited during imperialism. It's like all the countries were beat up and they needed a doctor, but instead someone just stopped beating them up, right? They need help after they were exploited and manipulated for almost 100 years in some cases. So, economics. The profits made through imperialism, and let me tell you, European countries made a lot of money off imperialism. They didn't benefit Africa. All the profits made in imperialism were sent back to Europe. Sure, there were some minor gains made, roads, railroads, harbors, cities, transportation improvements, some infrastructure was developed in Africa, but it was very basic. The primary economic activity was agriculture, and then Europeans just robbed them of all of their resources. They didn't educate the Africans. They didn't train the Africans. The Europeans wanted the various people they came in contact with to be submissive to them, so they didn't teach them, they didn't train them, they didn't try to advance them. So then after liberation, African nations were still dependent on European countries for economic help, basically, for brain power and for money. And they basically had no other option except to continue exporting raw materials and resources to the European countries that had previously taken over them. Plus, many independent individual Europeans owned large portions of these African countries, so profits still flowed out of Africa. So the European countries were economically hindered. They were economically handicapped from the legacy of imperialism. They were low on resources, they were low on development, they were low on good economic institutions, and they still relied on Europe for a lot of help. So economically, they're way behind. When it came to the political systems of Africa, they were largely destroyed during imperialism. Again, the Europeans wanted African countries to be submissive to them during imperialism, so usually a monarch type of government was created during imperialism because it's easy to control a small group of people and give them a little bit of profit so they'll, subjugate the rest of their population. So usually monarchies were used during imperialism and then they lingered thereafter. Democracy has really not flourished in Africa because it needs to be slowly developed and cultivated over time. And when you have a weak economy and a weak political system, it's very hard to advance. Right? You don't have any money, you're exploited for your resources, you have been systematically held back in your education, your healthcare, your economic development, and your political development for 100 years. It's going to take a long time to fix that stuff. Typically, in general, a rule of life is it's going to take you twice as long to fix something as it took you to create it, right? If you put a desk together in your house and it takes you an hour and you don't follow the directions, you do a really bad job, it's going to take you 2 hours to take it apart and rebuild it the right way with the instructions, right? If you systematically hold a country back politically, economically, educationally, healthcare wise for 100 years, it's going to take 200 years to be fixed. And again, I've been talking about this a lot here already today. Health and education. This is another area where there's a very, very negative impact from imperialism. There was very little medical services or education provided by the mother countries during the era of African imperialism. School was usually withheld so that Africans couldn't challenge their place, so they couldn't become educated and try to change things. Healthcare was also very minimal because healthcare is expensive, and these European countries are there to economically exploit and manipulate the African countries they're working with, so they're not going to spend a bunch of money on healthcare, right? Very little access. Basically, the only thing that they typically would give access to the African countries, they'd give them vaccines for smallpox, yellow fever, and malaria. But besides providing some basic vaccines, there's very little development of healthcare. Besides providing some very basic low-level education, there's no access to education, no development of education. So again, it's an entire continent whose development has been held back, hindered, and systemically miseducated, right? They were miseducated for all of imperialism. They were held back economically. They were held back politically. There's no development of your healthcare system. It's going to take a long time to fix all this stuff. Plus, all these things make each other worse. You're not educated. You're always sick. The political system can't deal with it, and everyone's poor. Whoa. Right? How in the world do you get out of that? There's no development of leadership. There's no development of anything, right? Because you've been exploited for so long. And then, to make things worse, if we go back to the Berlin Conference of 1884, remember, Europeans, they just arbitrarily drew borders. It was just like, we want this area. Okay, it's yours. What are we going to call it? We'll call it the country of Chad, right? So as independence grew, Africans inherited borders that were drawn by colonial powers that caused massive problems. Colonies were made that lumped people together who didn't get along, which led to civil war, which led to violence, which also led to some genocides, right? One of your vocab terms, you systematically try to destroy an entire group of people, right? So as a result of these poorly drawn borders, new nations were made full of hostile groups that competed for power and resources and didn't get along. So no one gets along, everybody's sick, everyone's undereducated, you don't have a good political system, you don't have a good economic system, everybody's poor, and there's no leadership in place because your development has been held back for 100 years. Where do you go from there, right? This provides all kinds of challenges and problems for an entire continent to face. So it's just nuts, right? All these problems just stack on top of each other, right? One small problem easy to solve. 150 million gigantic problems hard to solve, right? Now, imperialism's cost, last thing here, presents a lot of challenges, right? There's a lot of modern challenges that Africa faces. After World War II, as that independence movement swept across Africa, you have more than 50 new nations born into independence, right? Well, that independence is a challenge. People expected rapid economic and political development without fully understanding how the growth of these institutions had been held back for 100 years or so, right? So nations are independent and they're excited and they want to modernize and they want to, fix all their problems, but the problems are so big and they were left so vulnerable and they were held back so much that independence itself was a challenge, right? And there's no one there to really help, right? There's no international organization that says, oh, we'll show you how to build a successful country, because it's actually so hard, right? It's so hard to be a truly independent and successful country, right? Most countries fail. You've got poorly drawn borders, the inhibited growth, the civil war, the genocide, natural disasters, bad monarchies, military rule, corrupt dictatorships. It's hard to modernize when you have all these hurdles to overcome politically, economically, educationally, healthcare, borders. All these things are massive problems, right? And been very hard for modern for it's excuse me it's been very hard for the countries of Africa to modernize, right? For years all of their economic resources were taken, all of their money was taken, they were held back politically. So some nations have enjoyed some modernization and wealth, but the majority of African countries are struggling, right? With poverty, with educational problems, with political problems, with economic problems, because they've been held back so much, right? There's some resources there. There's hardworking people there. There's intelligent people there, but they need a lot more development. They need a lot more time to be able to figure out all of the challenges of independence and modernization, because again, they were systematically held back and stifled for so long. It'll take them twice as long to get out of the hole that they dug themselves into. Well, not even that they dug themselves into, that they were put into, right? So all kinds of problems here for the continent, but there's hope, right? There are some countries that are doing well. There are advances in education and healthcare. There are some advances in economics, but it'll still take more time. So there you go, ladies. That is your last lecture for Cultures and Civilizations. I wish I could be sitting with you in room 112 right now celebrating, but hey, here we are. All right, it's been a great year. You're going to have a study day on Thursday/Friday, and then, make sure you're preparing for that final test only on the virtual stuff. Many thanks for a great year. I can't wait to see you next year, and you guys are all sophomores, and make sure you swing by and say, hey, don't be a weirdo in the hallway and put your head down when you walk past my room. All right, say howdy. All right, y'all. Adios. Good times. Bye-bye.